2:45 in the morning, Saigon. Specialist Charles Daniel is standing at the night gate of the United States Embassy, and for the last few hours, nothing has happened. That is the job. Nothing happens. The compound behind him cost the United States government a fortune to build. 6 stories of reinforced concrete, finished only 4 months earlier, designed after a car bomb tore apart the old embassy building in 1965. This one was supposed to be different. This one was supposed to be unreachable. A taxi pulls up outside the wall. Then a small truck behind it. Doors open. Weapons come out. Daniel and the second gate guard, Private First Class William Seabost, open fire and get a radio call out before either of them has time to fully process what they are actually facing. Within seconds, an explosive charge tears a hole through 8 feet of embassy wall, a wall built specifically to stop this kind of assault. 19 armed men move through the gap into the compound grounds. Above them, on the roof of the chancery, a Marine sergeant named Rudy Soto is watching the muzzle flashes below and reaching for the only weapon he has, a 12-gauge shotgun. In a matter of minutes, it will jam in his hands. His backup is a .38 caliber revolver, a sidearm meant for close personal defense, not for holding a rooftop against a coordinated assault. That is the entire firepower standing in that first stretch of chaos between 19 armed attackers and the most important American building in South Vietnam. Nobody inside that compound knows it yet, but by the time the sun comes up over Saigon, this building will still be standing. Every attacker who came through that wall will be dead or in custody. On paper, in the strict military sense, the United States will have won. And somehow, that will not be enough. The real question of this night was never really whether the embassy would fall. It was whether, 6 hours later, anyone watching from the outside would still believe that America was actually winning this war, and whether tactical fact and public perception could survive contact with each other at all. To understand why 5 men with pistols and a jammed shotgun were the last line of defense for one of the most valuable American targets in Vietnam, you have to go back 3 years to a very different kind of attack. In March of 1965, a car packed with explosives detonated outside the old U.S. Embassy in downtown Saigon. 20 people were killed. Nearly 200 more were wounded. The message that came back from Washington was immediate and unambiguous. Build something that cannot be touched again. What went up in its place, finished in the fall of 1967, was a 6-story chancery set inside a walled, 4-acre compound, modern, imposing, engineered to project permanence and control at the exact moment American strategy needed both the South Vietnamese public and the American public to believe the war was being won. But a fortress is only ever as strong as the threat it was built to stop. The new embassy had been designed against the last attack, not the next one. Its planners were thinking about a parked car and a timed charge on a public street, not about a coordinated infantry-style assault launched from inside the city itself by men who had spent months studying the compound's routines before ever approaching the gate. Security on the ground reflected that same narrow assumption. 2 military policemen stood watch at the main gate, armed with standard sidearms and little else. A small detachment of Marine security guards, men whose peacetime duties often looked closer to ceremonial protocol than combat readiness, carried shotguns and pistols instead of rifles. When the question of issuing M16s to the Marine Guards came up, it was judged unnecessary. Saigon, in the official picture of the war at the start of 1968, was rear area territory. The fighting was supposed to be happening somewhere else, out in the provinces, not on the embassy's own front steps. That assumption was not unreasonable by the standards of the time. American commanders had spent months describing a war of steady, grinding progress against an enemy pushed increasingly onto the defensive. It was simply wrong about what was coming, and on the night of January 30th into January 31st, 1968, it was about to be tested by an enemy that had spent months preparing for exactly this moment as part of a coordinated nationwide offensive timed to the Tet Lunar New Year holiday, a moment when much of the South Vietnamese army itself was on leave. The Viet Cong sapper team approaching the embassy that night was not a handful of infiltrators looking for a soft target of opportunity. It was a trained demolition unit moving with prepared explosive charges, small arms, and a specific, narrow objective: breach the outer wall, seize and hold the compound grounds, and turn the single most photographed American address in South Vietnam into visible proof of American vulnerability, even if they never made it past the front steps of the chancery itself. Success for this unit was never defined as capturing the building. It was defined as simply being there visibly when morning came. There had been warnings in the weeks before that something larger was building across the country. Intercepted communications, unusual troop movements, a pattern that some intelligence officers read as preparation for a major offensive. But warnings of that kind had circulated before without producing an attack of this scale, and the prevailing assessment inside the American command in late January was that whatever was coming would fall on the border regions and the countryside where the war had always been fought, not on the government buildings sitting in the middle of Saigon itself. That assessment was not born of carelessness. It was born of an entire doctrine, reinforced by years of official reporting on enemy losses, on villages pacified, on a war narrative moving steadily in one direction, that had simply stopped expecting the fight to come to the capital's front door. That is the deeper failure sitting underneath the embassy's specific security shortfalls. The wall was too low, and the guards too lightly armed, yes, but those were symptoms of a larger blind spot, an institutional confidence that the enemy's capacity for this kind of coordinated urban strike had already been broken. The embassy compound simply happened to be the most visible place where that confidence would be tested in front of the widest possible audience within the first hours of the offensive. The attack does not begin as a battle. It begins as an ambush, and the first exchanges make that difference brutally clear. Daniel and Sebast, the two military policemen posted at the night gate, are the first Americans to see the enemy and the first to fall facing them, cut down in the initial exchange of fire as the demolition charge blows the hole through the embassy wall. Their radio call is what saves everyone else inside that compound. It buys the men still asleep or posted elsewhere the handful of seconds they need to understand that this is not a probe, not a diversion, but a direct assault already inside the wire. Two other military policemen, Sergeant Johnny Thomas and Specialist Owen Mabust, respond by jeep, racing toward the sound of gunfire exactly the way their training told them to. They never make it through the gate. A Viet Cong sniper is already positioned and waiting, and both men are killed before either can bring a weapon to bear on the threat. It is the starkest proof in the entire night of what happens when a security plan built around a single, predictable choke point meets an enemy that has already studied that choke point for months in advance. On the chancery roof, Sergeant Rudy Soto holds the only elevated firing position covering the compound below, and he has almost nothing to fight with. His shotgun jams within the first minutes of the engagement. This is not a dramatic twist added for effect. It is the direct, physical, traceable consequence of a decision made months earlier in an office far from any gunfire, when heavier weapons for the Marine Guards were judged an unnecessary expense against an unlikely threat. Soto is left holding a revolver, 6 rounds at a time, reloaded under fire, against sappers moving through the courtyard below with automatic weapons and satchel charges. This is the moment the documentary keeps circling back to, because it is the moment that actually defines the story. Not a battle lost, but a system exposed at exactly the point its designers never expected to be tested. The compound is not overrun, but for a stretch of minutes that feels far longer to the men living through it than it does on any after-action timeline, the only thing standing between 19 armed attackers and the chancery doors is whatever a handful of undergunned Americans can improvise in the dark with whatever happens to be in their hands. Other Marine Guards move to defensible positions around the compound's ground floor, working with what limited ammunition and cover they have, trading fire with sappers who are still disoriented from their own breach of the wall and uncertain in those first minutes of exactly what lies between them and the chancery entrance. That uncertainty on the attacker's side matters as much as anything the defenders do. The sappers know the compound's layout from planning and reconnaissance, but planning is not the same as executing under fire, in the dark, against men who are shooting back harder than expected from positions the plan did not fully account for. Neither side in these first minutes has anything close to a complete picture of the fight it is actually in. Inside the building, on the 4th floor, Foreign Service Officer Alan Wendt wakes to an explosion that shakes the walls hard enough to rattle the windows. He has no rifle, no assigned post, no combat role of any kind. What he has is a working telephone line, and in the hours that follow, that line becomes as operationally important as any weapon inside the compound, carrying word of what is unfolding out to a State Department operations center and, eventually, a White House Situation Room that otherwise have no reliable way of knowing whether the United States Embassy in Saigon still belongs to the United States. The gate could not stop the assault. What stops it from becoming an outright catastrophe is everything that had been built, deliberately or not, around the gate. Word of the attack reaches the 716th Military Police Battalion within minutes of Daniel's first radio call, and patrols begin converging on the embassy from positions across the city. This is the first real proof that the old system, however badly it performed at the single point of contact, was never actually designed to work alone. The two men at the gate were the first layer of defense, not the only one. Behind them stood a battalion capable of surrounding a fixed point in a city that is, at that exact hour, under coordinated attack on a dozen fronts at once, because the embassy is far from the only target that night. The Tet Offensive is unfolding simultaneously across Saigon, against the Mae Sivi compound, against Tan Son Nhut Air Base, in cities and provincial capitals throughout South Vietnam, all launched within the same narrow window of hours. MPs take up firing positions across the street and along the compound's outer perimeter, exchanging fire with the sappers, now effectively trapped inside the walls they had just breached. The Viet Cong team, cut off from any realistic path of retreat, sets up a machine gun position in a building facing the embassy grounds, a defensive measure that tells its own quiet story about the mission's actual design. These were never men expecting to fight their way back out. Their mission had never depended on holding the compound indefinitely or on escaping once the sun rose. It depended only on being there, visibly inside the wall, when the cameras and the daylight both arrived. Inside those walls, the sappers never come close to breaching the chancery itself. The building's reinforced construction, the very same concrete meant to withstand a car bomb, now works entirely in the defenders' favor, absorbing small arms fire and buying the outside perimeter the time it needs to close completely around the compound. It is the one part of the original 1967 design that performs exactly as its engineers intended, even while almost everything else about the security plan is being improvised in real time by men who were never meant to be the last line of defense. By the first hours after dawn, the tactical outcome of the fight is no longer in any serious doubt. The compound is contained. The attackers cannot advance further into the grounds, cannot escape back through the wall, and cannot coordinate with any relieving force, because no relief is coming for them. What remains from this point forward is not a fight to prevent defeat. It is a slower, more methodical fight to finish an encirclement that is already effectively decided, and to do it in full view of a city, and very soon a country, that is now watching. For the men trapped inside the chancery, none of that certainty from the outside makes the morning feel contained. It feels, from the fourth floor, like a siege with no clear end in sight. Went spends those early hours moving between the fourth floor and the roof, checking on wounded Marines, relaying updates through the one working phone line that is still open to Washington. Below him, another guard is hit and has to be carried up to the very same cot Went had been sleeping on hours earlier. A small, almost mundane detail that says more about the actual scale of this fight than any casualty count printed in a later report. There was no field hospital inside that building. There was a cot, a working telephone, and a small number of men doing whatever the moment in front of them required, almost entirely without regard to their actual job description or training. Outside, MPs and the surviving embassy guards keep the sappers pinned to the compound's open ground, unable to reach the chancery and unable to break back out through a cordon that is closing tighter with every passing street corner. The fighting through these middle hours is not continuous combat in any cinematic sense. It is long stretches of tension broken by sudden, sharp bursts of gunfire, real uncertainty about how many attackers remain active and where exactly they are positioned, and no reliable way for anyone trapped inside the building to know how the larger battle for the rest of Saigon is actually going. That uncertainty carries its own particular weight. Whence phone calls out of the building are not simply logistics updates passed along for the record. They are the only thread connecting a handful of exhausted men inside a besieged embassy to a government thousands of miles away that needs to know, in something close to real time, whether its embassy in Saigon still belongs to it. Every update he relays becomes one more link in a decision chain running all the way to the White House Situation Room, a scale of consequence that the men actually holding the compound, focused entirely on staying alive through the next 5 minutes, have no time or attention left to consider. By mid-morning, the character of the fight has visibly changed. The sappers inside the wall are no longer attempting to advance toward the chancery. They are simply trying to survive inside a perimeter that keeps shrinking around them, and the Americans outside the wall can see it happening. What nobody trapped inside the compound knows yet is that the next arrivals on the scene will not come to finish a battle that is, for all practical purposes, already over. They will come to make absolutely certain of it, regardless of what anyone already inside has to say. Across the rest of the city, the same pattern is repeating at other targets almost simultaneously. At the MACV compound, near the presidential palace, along the approach roads to Tan Son Nhat. None of that is visible from inside the embassy walls, but it shapes everything about how slowly help can actually arrive. The 716th patrols are not the only unit stretched across Saigon that morning, and every additional target the Viet Cong strike elsewhere in the city is one more claim on the same limited pool of MPs, military police reinforcements, and available combat units. The embassy is not being defended in isolation. It is being defended by a command structure trying to hold a dozen points at once, with resources built for a single, contained emergency, which is exactly the scenario the prevailing intelligence assessment had judged unlikely only days earlier. For Vent and the men around him, none of that wider picture offers any comfort in the moment. What they know is narrower and more immediate. How many rounds are left? How many of their own are wounded? And whether the gunfire outside is getting closer or further away. It is a peculiar kind of war to fight. Inside a building that the rest of the country will later understand as a single, decisive turning point, experienced by the people actually living through it as a string of uncertain, disconnected minutes with no clear sense of whether they were winning or simply surviving. Almost 6 hours after the first shots were fired at the night gate, a platoon of paratroopers from the 80th and Airborne Division arrives at the embassy compound. By this point, the shooting has largely stopped. 18 of the Viet Cong sappers are dead, killed over the course of the morning by military policemen, Marine guards, and civilian security personnel firing into the compound. 2 more are taken prisoner. No attacker at any point ever set foot inside the chancery itself. Wendt, still moving through the building, tells the newly arrived paratroopers exactly that. There is no remaining threat inside. They do not take his word for it. Their orders are to secure the embassy floor by floor, starting at the top, and that is precisely what they do, moving methodically down through 6 stories of a building that has already been, in every practical sense, successfully defended for hours by the very men now standing in front of them. It is not a failure of trust in Wendt personally. It is the moment the fight stops being about the enemy that came through the wall and starts being about certainty itself. Nobody arriving on the scene that morning is willing to be the officer who declared the embassy clear and was wrong about it. This is the turn the entire documentary has been building toward. The tactical battle for the compound was effectively decided hours earlier in the exchanges of fire between the sappers and the outnumbered guards and MP, who held the perimeter through the worst of the night. What happens now? A full floor-by-floor sweep of a building that has already been secured is no longer about winning the fight itself. It is about winning the certainty that the fight was won inside a war where certainty has become, for the people making decisions in Washington, almost as valuable a commodity as ground. Outside, the compound is filling with a very different kind of arrival. Journalists, photographers move through the courtyard, documenting bodies, blast damage along the outer wall, spent shell casings scattered across ground that 4 hours earlier was still an active kill zone. A wire service correspondent who had spent part of the firefight lying in the gutter just outside the wall is still there, close enough to see a wounded Viet Cong prisoner carried past under guard. None of what these journalists capture in the following minutes will change the tactical outcome of the battle in any way. Nearly all of it will shape how that outcome comes to be understood, first by editors back home, and then by an entire American public. By 9:20 that morning, the compound is formally declared secured. The arithmetic of the battle is now fixed. 5 Americans dead, 4 military policemen and 1 Marine, against an attacking force that lost nearly all 19 of its men, killed or captured, without ever once breaching the building they had come to seize. Among the dead is Corporal James Conrad Marshall, the Marine security guard killed defending the compound, the first Marine embassy guard in American history to die in that specific role. His name, alongside the 4 military policemen who fell that night, would later be engraved on a plaque inside the compound, a quiet and permanent counterweight to everything the attack itself had been designed to project to the outside world. The cost of that night was never measured, only in the 5 men killed. It was carried afterward by the survivors as well, by Soto, who fought most of the battle with a jammed shotgun and a 6-shot revolver, by Wendt, who spent the entire morning improvising as an unofficial communications officer with no training whatsoever for that role, by the wounded, who were carried up to a cot that had briefly, hours earlier, simply been someone's bed before the war arrived at the front door. Then, General William Westmoreland, commander of American forces in Vietnam, arrives on the scene in person. His instruction to embassy staff is direct and specific: have the compound cleaned up and employees back at their desks by noon. On its face, this is a request about logistics and continuity of operations. In practice, it is the clearest single piece of evidence in the entire episode of what the old system had actually been built to protect in the first place. Not simply a building, but an image of control. The embassy needed to look as quickly and completely as possible as though nothing significant had happened there at all. That order, arguably more than any single exchange of gunfire that morning, reveals just how much of this war, by January of 1968, was already being fought on the level of perception and public confidence, running in parallel with the level of terrain and body counts. It was, by any conventional military measure available at the time, an unambiguous American tactical victory. Every attacker was dead or in captivity. The chancery itself had never fallen, and yet within days, photographs and film footage of the assault, the blown-open section of wall, the bodies scattered across the courtyard, American guards trading fire on the grounds of their own embassy in the heart of an Allied capital, had reached television screens across the United States, arriving at the exact moment a large share of the American public had spent months being told the war was steadily, measurably being won. Inside the compound itself, the practical aftermath moved quickly. Damage crews began assessing the blown section of wall and the bullet-scarred lower floors of the chancery within hours. Embassy staff, who had spent the morning locked in offices or crouched in stairwells, were expected back at their desks that same day, processing cables and receiving visitors as though the courtyard outside had not, a few hours earlier, been an active battlefield. That speed was not incidental. It was the point. The faster the compound could visibly return to normal function, the faster the image of control could be restored, even while the tactical facts of the morning were still being tallied by military police, filling out incident reports a few hundred yards away. It is tempting to say the Viet Cong won the Battle of the Embassy that night. The evidence does not support that claim. Every man who came through that wall was ultimately killed or taken prisoner. Not one of them ever reached the chancery doors. Militarily, judged purely by the standard of holding ground and denying an objective, this was as close to a clean defensive success as a besieged position could realistically produce. What actually explains the outcome of that night, and everything that followed from it, comes down to a small number of factors working against each other at the very same time. A security doctrine built to stop the last attack, not the next one, left the men at the gate genuinely outmatched in the opening minutes, with equipment chosen for an unlikely threat rather than the coordinated assault that actually arrived. The layered response built up behind that first thin line. The 716th Military Police Battalion converging from across the city, the perimeter that steadily closed around the compound, the reinforced construction of the Chancery building itself, held the line that the initial defense alone could never have held. And running underneath all of it, shaping everything that happened after the shooting stopped, was a widening mismatch between what was actually true on the ground and what the war's leadership needed the American public to continue believing was true. That mismatch is the real subject of this story, not simply a fight for 4 acres of walled ground in downtown Saigon, but a test of whether tactical fact and public understanding could still be made to line up with each other after 3 years of steadily rising American commitment. For years, American officials had described a war of grinding, measurable progress against an enemy in retreat. The sight of American guards fighting for their lives inside the walls of their own embassy did not need to change the actual military math of that war to change the public's confidence in the story being told about it. It only needed to be seen clearly on the evening news. In the months that followed, the assault on the embassy became one of the moments most consistently cited as a genuine turning point in American public support for the war. Not because it represented any real military defeat on the ground, but because it exposed, in the most visible way possible, the growing distance between official assurances of progress and what ordinary Americans were now watching unfold on their own television screens. A widely circulated broadcast assessment from a leading American news anchor in the weeks that followed captured that shift directly, questioning aloud whether the war could still be described as being won. It was a single voice, but it echoed something that had already been building in the public mood since the morning, the embassy grounds filled with journalists photographing bodies in the courtyard. Historians still debate how much weight any single event or any single broadcast should carry in explaining that broader shift in public opinion. What is not seriously disputed is that this particular night mattered disproportionately to how the entire war came to be understood from that point onward. There is a narrower myth worth correcting here as well, one that has followed this story for decades. The idea that the sappers who attacked the embassy were somehow an elite, irresistible force that any ordinary defense would have failed to stop. The record does not support that either. They were a capable, well-prepared unit executing a narrow and achievable objective: breach the wall, hold the ground, be seen. They were never equipped or apparently intended to fight their way into the chancery itself, and once the perimeter closed, they had no realistic path to escape or reinforcement. Their success was never measured in ground held. It was measured entirely in the 6 hours of uncertainty they created, and in how far that uncertainty traveled once the cameras arrived. The compound itself no longer stands. The Chancery building that Charles Daniel, William Sebast, Rudy Soto, and the men beside them held through that long night was eventually demolished decades later. In its place, on a quiet stretch of sidewalk in what is now Ho Chi Minh City, a small plaque marks the spot where 5 Americans died defending a wall that was never supposed to be seriously tested, and where, for nearly 6 hours, holding the ground turned out to be the easier half of the battle.